r/NoSleep. The Unspoken Rules of the Cemetery's Keeper. The job was supposed to be simple: watch over the cemetery, keep the gates locked at night, and ensure the grounds remained undisturbed. It was easy money for someone like me: no friends, no family, and no real ambition. The caretaker job was my fresh start, a chance to disappear into anonymity. But I didn't realize what I was stepping into. The cemetery, known as Hollow Hill, was ancient, its origins lost to time. Rows of weathered headstones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions faded and forgotten. Towering oaks cast long shadows over the grounds, even in the daylight. Local stories about the place were plentiful but vague. People spoke in hushed tones about the unspeakable buried in Hollow Hill, but no one could, or would, explain further. Mrs. Calloway, the elderly owner of the cemetery, hired me without much ceremony. She was frail, her hands gnarled like the trees that surrounded the graveyard, but her voice carried an unexpected strength. "Keep the grounds tidy," she instructed, her pale blue eyes boring into mine. "And whatever you do, don't touch the marker on the east end after sundown." The marker. I noticed it my first day, a tall, black obelisk that stood apart from the other graves. No name, no date, just strange symbols etched into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift when you stared too long. I dismissed her warning as superstition. Every cemetery has its ghost stories, right? For the first few weeks, everything was fine. The job was quiet, the kind of isolation I'd been craving. I spent my days trimming hedges, raking leaves, and ignoring the occasional chill that crept up my spine when I passed the obelisk. But then came the whispers. They started faint, like the rustling of leaves on a windless night. I'd hear them near the obelisk, low and indistinct. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the product of too many long, lonely nights. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. Words began to take shape. "Let us out," they said. "Free us." I avoided the East End after dark, just as Mrs. Calloway had warned. But the whispers didn't care. They followed me home, invading my dreams and waking hours alike. I started sleeping with the lights on, not that it helped. Shadows in my small caretaker's cabin seemed to writhe on their own, taking forms just out of reach. When I finally confronted Mrs. Calloway, she was evasive. "You should have left well enough alone," she said, her voice trembling. "They only want you because you've heard them now. That makes you a bridge." "A bridge to what?" I demanded. "To the other side." That night, I broke her rule. The whispers had turned into screams by then, desperate and angry. I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a crowbar, I marched to the obelisk under the pale light of the full moon. As I approached, the air grew thick and cold, my breath fogging in front of me despite the summer heat. "Fine," I muttered. "What do you want?" The obelisk seemed to hum in response, the symbols glowing faintly. My hand moved on its own, tracing the carvings, and the moment my fingers connected with the stone, the ground trembled beneath my feet. A jagged crack split the earth around the marker, and a black, tar-like substance began to seep from the opening. "Thank you," a voice said, a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. Then, they emerged. They weren't ghosts, and they weren't human. Their forms shifted and writhed like living shadows, their faces blank except for gaping, toothless mouths. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, crawling out of the earth as if dragging themselves from some other realm. I ran. Behind me, I heard Mrs. Calloway shouting, her voice thick with fear and rage. "You fool! You've unleashed them." The creatures didn't stop. They swarmed the cemetery, spreading beyond its gates into the town beyond. I made it back to the cabin and locked the door, but I knew it wouldn't hold. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was a shadow creeping under the door, reaching for me with elongated fingers. The next morning, the town was silent. Hollow Hill was silent. But the obelisk was gone, leaving nothing but a gaping hole where it once stood. I'm still here, still alive somehow. The whispers are gone, replaced by something worse, an oppressive, endless silence. And in that silence, I wait, knowing they'll come for me again. Because once you open the door to the other side, it doesn't close. Because once you open the door to the other side, it doesn't close. I thought I'd gotten away. For weeks after that night, nothing happened. The cemetery was eerily silent, the town even more so. The few residents who had lingered after Hollow Hill's strange reputation had spread now packed up and left without a word. Shops closed. Windows were boarded up. The once quaint streets were now a hollow shell of what they had been. I should have left too. But where would I go? Who would believe me if I tried to explain? Something about the cemetery, about the obelisk, still felt tied to me, like a chain I couldn't shake. Even when the whispers had been replaced by silence, I felt watched. Not by people. By them. I began keeping a journal, trying to put the events into words to make sense of them. Most entries started with a question: why me? Was it because I touched the obelisk? Or was it something worse? Had they marked me, like Mrs. Calloway said? It was on the 13th day after the obelisk vanished that the nightmares started. At first, they were simple. I'd see the black obelisk rising from the earth, glowing with that eerie, shifting light. But as the nights went on, the dreams became more vivid. I was back in the cemetery, the air cold and suffocating. The obelisk wasn't just rising, it was splitting open, revealing something inside. Something alive. The figures were there again. The ones I'd freed. They weren't just emerging anymore, they were waiting for me. Standing in a half circle, motionless, their eyeless faces turned toward me. And then one of them would step forward, its long, twisted hand reaching out, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat. By the second week, it wasn't just in my dreams. I'd catch glimpses of them in the corner of my eye. Dark shapes flickering just out of sight. Shadows that didn't belong to anything real. The silence became unbearable, every creak of the old cabin making my heart race. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every moment felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it did. On the 21st night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my cabin. Slow, deliberate, circling the walls. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, clutching the small flashlight I kept under my pillow. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But the footsteps stopped at the door, and I knew I had no choice. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. At first, there was nothing. Just the night and the faint outlines of the trees. Then the light caught something moving. It wasn't a person, not even close. The creature was pressed against the glass, its face stretched and twisted, its hands clawing at the window pane. Its eyeless sockets stared into me, and its jagged mouth opened into a soundless scream. The flashlight flickered, and the thing was gone. But the door handle began to turn. I didn't wait. Grabbing my jacket and boots, I bolted out the back door, sprinting toward the cemetery. I don't know why that was my instinct. Maybe I thought Mrs. Calloway would be there, or maybe I thought the cemetery itself would have answers. But the moment I stepped onto the grounds, I knew I'd made a mistake. They were waiting for me. The shadows stretched unnaturally, forming shapes that slithered and crawled. The figures from my dreams were there, their forms more solid, more real. They didn't move at first, just stood there, watching, their heads tilting in unison. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice said. I turned to see Mrs. Calloway standing by the old caretaker's shed, her frail form trembling. In her hands was an old lantern, its flame barely illuminating her features. "You brought them here," she said, her voice filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "Now they'll finish what you started." "I didn't mean to," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," she snapped. "But ignorance won't save you now." She motioned for me to follow her into the shed, and I hesitated for only a moment before obeying. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves of strange objects, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, old books with crumbling spines, and crude carvings of symbols similar to those on the obelisk. Mrs. Calloway slammed the door shut and began lighting more lanterns, the warm glow filling the cramped space. "This place was never meant for the living," she said, her voice low. "It's a prison. A barrier. The obelisk was the key, and you," she jabbed a finger at me, "you turned it." "I didn't know," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. She ignored me, pulling an old book from the shelf and flipping through its brittle pages. "There's only one way to stop them now," she said. "We have to seal them back underground. But it'll take a sacrifice." My stomach churned. What kind of sacrifice? Her eyes met mine, and I knew the answer before she said it. "A life for a life." Mrs. Calloway explained the ritual with a grim efficiency, as if she'd been preparing for this moment for years. The obelisk had been more than a marker, it was a tether, binding the creatures to the earth. Without it, they were free to roam, but they still needed an anchor, something to tie them to this world. That anchor was me. "If we sever their connection to you," she said, "we can banish them. But it'll come at a cost." I didn't ask what would happen to me. I already knew. The ritual took place at the cemetery's center, beneath the gnarled branches of the oldest oak. Mrs. Calloway drew a circle of symbols around me, muttering incantations under her breath. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the night itself was pressing down on us. The figures appeared one by one, their forms coalescing from the shadows. They didn't attack, didn't move, they simply watched, their eyeless faces turned toward me. I felt their whispers in my mind, not as words but as a crushing weight of despair and hunger. "Don't move," Mrs. Calloway warned. She held a dagger in her hands, its blade etched with the same symbols as the obelisk. "When the moment comes, you'll know." I didn't have time to ask what she meant. The creatures began to move, closing the circle around me. Their forms writhed and twisted, their jagged mouths opening in unison. The dagger gleamed in the moonlight as Mrs. Calloway stepped forward. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Before I could react, she plunged the dagger into her own chest. The circle erupted in light, blinding and searing. The creatures screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the light consumed them. I felt the ground shake beneath me, and then everything went still. When I woke, the cemetery was quiet. Mrs. Calloway's body lay at the center of the circle, her face peaceful. The symbols on the ground had burned into the earth, leaving permanent scars. I buried her beneath the old oak, marking her grave with a simple stone. The whispers were gone, and the air felt lighter, but I knew it wasn't over. The obelisk was still missing, and the creatures. They were still out there, somewhere. I left Hollow Hill that day, but its shadows followed me. They always will. Because once you open the door to the other side, it doesn't close. It only waits.